Hello and welcome to the Greenlight Guru True Quality Virtual Summit, the three-day event designed to provide actionable takeaways you can implement in your own company to innovate faster, stay ahead of regulatory changes, and use quality as a strategic asset to grow your device business. This session is on game-changing product definition tactics. My name is Wade Schrader, medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We've got a really special session scheduled for you today. I know our speaker, Scott Phillips, is really looking forward to sharing transformational discoveries and decisions that affected the outcomes of medical device ventures. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our speaker, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, this session is going to run for about 45 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Scott has been kind enough to answer your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation as they come up in the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will get to as many of them as time permits. This entire session will be recorded. Once this session wraps up, there is a 10-minute break before the next live session begins. If you're interested in learning medical device project pitfalls and how to avoid them, I encourage you to make sure you're registered for the following session and use your unique link to tune in. If you aren't already signed up, you can register for the next session and over 20 others at virtual-summit.greenlight.guru. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on this free virtual summit. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission as many of you at today's summit. Anything we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether it's through hosting free events and training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device companies, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from around the globe are moving away from paper-based general-purpose quality management systems and adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management software, I encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. In doing so, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging our purpose-built quality management software to gain ISO 13485 certification, market approval, breeze through audits, and push beyond just compliance to produce true quality medical devices. So, if you're interested in learning how we can help your device company, make sure you visit www.greenlight.guru after today's webinar and schedule your personalized demo. Now, on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenter today, Scott Phillips. Scott Phillips is CEO of the StarFish group of companies, including StarFish Medical and Vivitro Labs, Inc. StarFish Medical is Canada's largest medical device design company, offering award-winning design, development, and manufacturing services. Scott holds a degree in engineering physics from the University of British Columbia. Under his leadership, StarFish has grown into a diverse professional organization with clients around the world and 100% focus on medical devices. Scott is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, winner of the EY Entrepreneur of the Year 2017 Pacific Awards Technology category, chairman of the Life Sciences British Columbia Board, and volunteers with Junior Achievement, Entrepreneurs Organization, and University of British Columbia. Before I hand it over to Scott, I ask you to take a moment to answer the polling question on the right side of your screen. And without further ado, I'll introduce Scott Phillips of StarFish Medical.
All right, thanks so much, Wade. It's a real pleasure. It's not often we get to speak to 2,000 people all virtually. That's very impressive. So I see that we have an interesting mix of background, and we also, I had to scan through some of the email domains of the registrants. So I see that there's also a mix of corporate and startup. So I'll try to address both. We work for both, of course. First of all, by means of introduction, let me tell you a little bit about StarFish, just so you'll have a sense of sort of the context. So we do have two main offices in Victoria and Toronto, serve companies primarily in North America. What we're known for is electromechanical products. So we don't tend to work on bandages, and we don't tend to work on pacemakers, sort of mostly class 3, a little bit of, or mostly class 2, I mean, a little bit of class 3. Got about 140 people. I don't keep track exactly. Various technical strengths that if you're really interested in that, I can tell you more about that later. Let's move next slide, please. So in terms of client mix, more or less matches the audience, mix of some large corporate and a lot of startups. We like them both, and I think our frameworks for product definition are fairly resilient to work with both types of companies. Alrighty, next slide. In terms of the sorts of things we develop, these are what things look like. You can see that we'd like to focus on things that are beautiful. We like them to be functional. And there's a big difference between two products that both look really beautiful, but one of them is really designed for the needs of the user and one of them's not. So we very much want to be in the latter category. And ultimately, our focus is trying to help companies be valuable. If you're a startup company, we want you as a startup founder to end up with a big chunk of a valuable thing, which actually is surprisingly different than a lot of companies in the field. So let's go to the next slide and the next one, please. Okay, so where do we start? We start with a framework. And this is our framework. We call it Pathfinder. And it's, it's not over formal. If you're in the startup game, you probably are familiar with something called the lean or the product definition or the sorry, I don't know what happened to my microphone. Value product, sort of the value proposition canvas or so this is kind of like a canvas for product definition. These are all the different areas. Doesn't talk about too much about how they interact, but you can see the different areas. And if you download the presentation later, you can see them. And I'm going to talk to some of these. One thing I have observed that the best people in this field seem to just have a knack. Always something. So.
Looks like they're experiencing some technical difficulties, so I appreciate everyone's patience with this. I'm sure, as you guys all know, it's the joy of hosting live events, all the technical difficulties that go along with it. So awesome.
Okay, hello, can you hear me now, Wade?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So, Yeah, it's kind of remarkable. I'll talk about a few of those people in a moment, but so the first breakthrough tactic is really being comprehensive, covering a variety of the major factors and not missing anything really important. And almost always when we get into an early discovery call with a new prospective client, we find that somewhere in one of these boxes there's a black hole. There's something that they really haven't considered that, and once we have a chance to start talking to them about it, dramatically affects their sense of what direction their company is going to go. And I can't give you a comprehensive list. Some of that just comes from decades of experience. But so let me start by broadening the scope a little bit. So if I could go to the next slide. Here's my premise. If you're a startup company, the company and the product should be designed together. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So let's go to the next slide. Here's a company. It's called Aspect Biosystems. Spun out of a university. And what they did is they figured out a way of printing tissue. So, for example, they could print a portion of trachea, for example. And you have little cilia waving around on the inside of it. And if you give it an asthma medication, it will actually expand and contract. It's pretty remarkable technology, multicellular matrix. So the question for them was, what should the company sell? Should it sell machines for 3D printing, or should it sell tissue? And if it sells tissue, should it sell tissue for drug discovery and sort of repeatable models for tissue for validation of, or should it sell tissue for transplant? And each of those three directions would be dramatically different and would affect dramatically what their product definition should look like, right? So interestingly enough, what they decided to do was a bit of a hybrid. They started by selling some machines, but they retained the rights to any tissue that came out of that. And ultimately that right now, if you look at their press releases and so on, they've announced a number of partnerships with different pharma companies. And so they're focused on the drug validation. And so it's sort of how can you take some things that would require clinical work and be able to do them in vitro and save a lot of money and time. So that's their model. So let's move to the next one. This is another interesting company. Both these companies happen to be in Vancouver. This company is called Abselura and spun out of a research institution again. And what their technology is rapid antibody discovery. It's actually incredible. So, typically antibody discovery is done with pipettes one at a time, and it's very labor intensive, takes a lot of expertise. And so what these guys did is they figured out a platform for testing 300,000 antibodies at a time in a couple of hours. Revolutionary, like dramatic, so in their first couple of test cases, they were able to, dramatically affect the whether a pharma company could find the right target. And so then they had to make a decision. So are we a technology company? Do we sell these analyzers? But it turns out there's only so many pharma companies in the world that are interested in antibodies. You can only sell so many machines. So they ultimately decided that their product would actually be research, and they wouldn't sell their machines at all. They would actually hold them internally, and they would only do tests for other people. So in fact, this is a very interesting time for them. This last month, I was just looking at some of their press releases. So they just announced last week $105 million Series B financing. A week before that, they announced a multi-year partnership with Eli Lilly, and it was to look at 8 targets. That's pretty interesting. That a major multi-year partnership with Eli Lilly would focus on 8 targets. You can imagine how many targets there would be in the world for them to go after. The first one, unsurprisingly, is COVID. So I think we're going to see some significant results out of them in that area. So next slide, please. The next case study, this is actually a guy, Amr Salier, one of my friends, and actually one of my heroes of product definition. And I think this is particularly interesting because so he's actually Syrian a mechanical engineer, went to Case in Cleveland. And he spent the early part of his career in a couple different cardiovascular startups. And from there, through acquisition, he ended up as a VP for Boston Scientific. And then he really got into his entrepreneurial career. And and so his first company that he created was called Sadra, which is a percutaneous heart valve company focused on the aortic valve, and did extremely well. Was able to sell it for several $100 million, and he moved on to the next one, which was Maya, which was a renal denervation company. And from there, he went to Abselura Medical, which just, I think, last year was sold, again, for hundreds of millions of dollars in atrial fibrillation. So all the ones on the left side of the screen there, you see 6 of them. Those ones are already exited. And the next one's on the right. The other 5 of them, is that right? Maybe it's the other way around. But yes, the ones on the right are exited. The ones on the left are not exited yet. And so now he's got 6 active companies going on. All of them are revolutionary. And so I had lunch with him a couple months ago. I said, so Amer, you got so many things going on. Some of them you must have to kill these programs. And how do you decide to do that? And he said, oh yeah, it happens all the time. And so I said, well, is that because the market's not big enough? Or is that because there's more regulatory problem than you thought? What is it? And he says, no, they're all huge markets. They all have potential. That's kind of our it's the table stakes to get in the game. Really, what the thing that would make me kill a venture is I want to exit pre-revenue, and if I don't understand the buyers and it's not clear to me how they're going to make their decision, then I'll kill it. So I thought that's just incredible discipline from a product definition master. That part of that product definition framing is actually the whole business dynamics, and only getting into the right businesses that have the right exit profile that he's looking for. So I think just to wind up on this broad framing question, if we go to the next slide, there's this sort of debate in the industry. Should you start with a clinical problem or a technical solution? And the sort of the truism, or the Steve Jobs idea, is that you should start with a clinical problem and work your way back to the right technology. And honestly, we see it the other way around most of the time. There's people, and we think that that's just fine. Next slide, please. So here's my brilliant wisdom for you. Yes, either way is fine. And actually, let's go to the next slide. It's here's a fellow actually spoke at one of our conferences. We run conferences from medical technology called Medical Device Playbook, which if you're interested in that, look it up, and you can sign up. And so Stan Lapidus was one of the speakers. This guy is incredible. He actually built 2 multi-billion-dollar startups, Cytic and Exact Sciences. Both of them are in cancer diagnostics, dramatically different approaches. The first one actually exemplified the first. He was playing around with filtering and ways to spread out cells for some research, and he discovered a way to actually make pap smears way more effective. And so it was actually just started by curiosity-driven research and so on. It wasn't started by trying to make pap smears better, but ended up building really the sample prep company for pap smears. And from there, he decided, well, what's the next big cancer we can go after? And he thought, well, it's actually colorectal cancer. And he actually built a whole company built on an entirely different technology platform in order to go after colorectal diagnostics. And again, in a period of 7 years, managed to build a multi-billion-dollar success story. So and here's another example. The next one is a company called Novadac, which you may be familiar with. This is a fellow named Rick Mangat. His PhD research was in fluorescence. I ended up building a whole fluorescence imaging company called Novadac, which started in skin and then ultimately went to endoscopic, and it was sold to Stryker for about $1 billion. So it was a very, very good success story. So let's move on to a little bit more specifics, and I'll get back to our framework in a sec. How many customer discovery discussions should you have? Honestly, the single biggest challenge that we see when people come to us to talk about their products is that they've spent way too much time in the lab and not enough time out in the field talking to their customers. And we've even had cases, multiple cases, where, for example, there was a company that was doing validation of radiation therapy, three-dimensional model, three-dimensional validation. And they got all the way to launching their product before they realized that they'd made a product nobody wanted. I don't think they even sold one. That's it. And really, there was no problem with the technology. There was no problem with the manufacturability. Everything was fine, all except the fact that they designed a product that nobody wanted. So that's kind of tragic. So really, although we're engineers, we don't want to build products that nobody wants. And so we really counsel people to spend a lot more time out in the field talking to people. We have one client right now. It's in the dental robotics area. So when they went to try to validate their market, they actually did a clever thing. They actually went out to get letters of intent. Obviously, the regulators won't allow us to go selling things that don't exist, but you can get LOIs to buy things in the future. So they actually managed to get over $12 million worth of LOIs. There's nothing more honest. And I mentioned in the promotional materials that I would talk about how to avoid biases. Well, there's nothing more honest than somebody promising to write you a check. Because people saying they will buy a product in the future, that's easy to say. People writing you a letter that you can show to your investors saying, I hereby promise that I plan to buy or indicate I plan to buy this product when it's available. So they got $12 million. And in the process, they actually discovered some very, very important segmentation of the market. And I won't go into all the things that they discovered, but really it was kind of non-intuitive. They actually broke out the market in several different ways, and that will dramatically affect their product definition as we get into it. So next slide, please. Here's my rule of thumb. Talk to about 100 people. And it's important to ask them questions that aren't leading questions. Don't presume the success of your outcome or the desirability of the thing you're trying to make. It's hard to do. It's a bit of an art form, and that's a whole other talk. But you should notice after you talk to people for a while that you're hearing the same answers over and over and over again. And if you keep finding you're learning new things, well, keep going. Because after a while, you'll start to see the patterns be a little more clear. Okay, here's an interesting example of a company that we got involved with, a company called Hemosonix out of Virginia. At the prototype, at the stage when we got involved, it was a little cuvette, a little holder for blood. You put it in, they put it in a water bath, and they would fire ultrasound at it, and then they would observe that they could watch that blood clotting. They could actually measure the propensity of blood for clotting. And so we went out in the field with them and talked to a lot of hospitals and doctors and watched some surgeries and so on. And ultimately, the things that came out of that discovery were remarkable. So one of them was that we needed 4 channels in parallel. One of them was that we actually did a technical innovation. You see those little circles near the top of the consumable there. Those are actually ultrasound lenses, which there really is no such thing as an ultrasound lens prior to that, as far as we know. So we had to do some technical innovation. They managed to narrow down on the clinical indication, which is coronary artery bypass graft. And then there's all of this focus on the reader and the consumable and sort of the cartridge-based microfluidic approach. That all came out of that early customer discovery as well. And that company ultimately was able to sell to a French multinational for over $100 million. So it was a really good success, but it took a long time to get the value proposition, the product definition dialed in properly. So let's move on. So coming back to our framework, now I'm going to cover a couple of these things. There's obviously, it takes longer than half an hour to walk through all these boxes, do them any sort of justice. One thing I will mention is that often people ask, what sort of person should do this kind of work? In my estimation, the ideal people for the early part of the project are broad-thinking, creative, flexible kind of people. If you did a Myers-Briggs test on them, you'd find they have a P. Their last letter will be a P. If their last letter is a J, don't let them anywhere near the front end of the project. They're really important. They're the only ones that are going to keep the wheels on, because the peels will drive you into the ditch. the P's will drive you in the ditch, but when it comes to implementation, but they will do a brilliant job of being flexible and connecting dots in non-intuitive ways. And we do see a lot where more finishing kind of people try to follow a checklist, and it just doesn't lend itself to this early stage kind of work. That's obviously a whole talk on its own as well. Another thing is to think in terms of risk. There's a lot of questions you could be asking. What are the actual most consequential things? And that depends on your context. You can only answer that yourself. Which of these things matter the most in your context? And another thing that needs to happen in the early going is actually enunciating hypotheses and then quickly killing them. What are the biggest risk items? How can you enunciate that as a hypothesis? What can you do to prove that's true or not? And you can learn a lot without having to go to expensive, elaborate exercises of building full prototypes and so on. You can just test your concepts, and don't forget that it's not just a technical concepts. That's why this thing is covered so broadly. There are concepts to do with risk. There are concepts to do with, do you have a sales channel? Have you thought about a disposable strategy? Do you understand your regulatory framing? Actually, there's often guidances that will constrain you. What are the IP constraints? The human factor side of it is much bigger than most people realize. So we do have a Gates checklist. I'll talk to that towards the end here. Let's move to the next slide. So picking 3 of those boxes that are sort of related: the workflow, human factors, user needs, experience. All that comes down to contextual research. So let's take a look at the next slide here as an example. So if you can take a look at that, this is actually at, I believe, Stanford, and this was to do with an ultrasound device for intravascular ultrasound we were trying to work on. So there's an interventional cardiologist, and if you look closely at the top 3 pictures, you'll see that that's not actually a real device. That the interface is paper, and you'll see that those hand grips around the outside of the device are actually plastic plumbing pipes. And so, really, what we're trying to do is mimic the operating environment. So we can talk to the surgeon and try to imagine that they're using the device, and they're giving us feedback as to what information that they need. That would be really helpful. And then down below, as part of the same investigation, on the right, you see sort of the context. That's where the procedure will be taking place. And here we are interviewing that fellow on the left with the book is actually one of our industrial designers. And he's just getting dispassionate research about how people are going to act. Let's keep moving. Here's another interesting example. This is on the more corporate side. This is a public corporate that we were working for, and this was their existing product. And you can see there's a couple of issues, and some of them are kind of obvious. Like this is an infant audiology hearing screening device. You can see that the initial designers didn't think too much about the connectors, and they're sort of sharp and ungainly, don't really fit into the context of the machine, and there's not really a spot to put the machine. And the nurses end up building a little, they put blankets beside the baby and tuck the machine in there. So it's not really, they didn't really think about some of that. I would say that's probably a case of context. They didn't think broadly enough. So let's move to the next slide. One thing we realized is that these bassinets are all very, very similar, and we were able to actually do some innovation simply on the human factors industrial design side to give the people a place to put it, and it was a very successful product. So let's move on. This is another product. We end up flying around with air ambulance people. So this is a military product mostly, and they're trying to move into consumer, or not, into the civilian market. And what it does is it puts an IV into your bone marrow of your sternum. So we learned a lot of amazing things by flying around with air ambulance people, and by going out to military bases and talking to the EMT techs. And we learned that they had trouble aligning it. They learned that it put a lot of force. They learned that it was scary for people. It was hard to use, etc. And out of that, we learned enough lessons that we were able to go to the next slide, please. We're able to come up with this product, which was lighter, much lower force to deploy, easier to carry, safer, protected the IV better. And that company was ultimately sold as well to a company called Teleflex. We're getting a little tight on time, so I'll just jump more quickly. Jump over this slide, please. Next one. So this is an example of being a little bit more thorough and mapping out the workflows and looking at all the things that are done by who, when. And a lot of people are not really very, you know, it doesn't come naturally. But if you actually break it all down, you can start to see patterns, and then you can start to recognize opportunities to make big steps forward. Okay, I'll get you to jump a couple slides forward, please. This one, yeah. So here's another interesting example. Also in the corporate side, we were asked, and this is not the actual product we worked on, but it was of this nature. It was an orthopedic surgical support table. And so initially it had a relatively limited scope. There was some new electrical safety standards we had to comply with. But we asked, could we look at the service records? Could we look at the customer complaint files? A lot of the quality system documentation. And this is an older product we were working on. So a lot of the people, the original people had the vision of the product were gone. And so we discovered quite a few very interesting, useful things that were able to make dramatic improvements in the product just by being comprehensive and recognizing that even within the organization, there was a lot of important information that was sequestered in other departments, and we were able to bring that all together and have a big impact on the next generation product. So next thing. Here's an example of a product we worked on. This is to do with blood platelet quality using laser backscatter. For us techie nerds, it was like a little paradise of, you know, we got to use Peltier coolers and embedded Linux and FPGAs and all sorts of fun stuff. But really the biggest innovation, other than the integration of it all, was really, I think, making it fit the work environment properly. You know, the lab have no, where this was intended to be used in a lab, they have no counter space. So we made it long and very, very deep so that it would take up as little counter space as possible. The other products in the area didn't have any obvious place to put the platelets. So we made a little tray on the top to put the platelets where you'd still be able to see the screen. It's kind of interesting that, in my view, adoption is really driven by usability as much as technical solution. So although we're technical engineers, and often technical engineers are the ones figuring these things out, we have to kind of get over ourselves. That would be another important breakthrough tactic, if you will, of just getting over yourself, just trying to see it from the end user perspective. Okay, next one, please. I'll quickly show you an interesting case where, next slide, please. This is I asked actually a cystic fibrosis sufferer who developed this prototype, actually based on mechanical oscillation. You know, these poor guys, they get all this phlegm built up in their chest, and so this guy figured that if he could just rattle the phlegm loose, then his life would be better, and he wanted it to be able to walk around with. And so he came up with this mechanical oscillator concept. And it's kind of one of those tragedies of the rare disease. There's just not enough people like that for companies to spend a lot of money developing product and tooling it all up and everything. So on the technical optimization side, we actually suggested that he go to a whole other direction, which was voice coils. And so if you see the next slide, what it looked like in our prototype stage, which actually was pretty cool. He's pretty happy with it. He was able to walk around, actually significantly improved his life. And then his company was able to sell that to Hill-Rom when they launched a product. Now it's called the Monarch, which is based on this technology. So that's pretty cool. Thank you. Okay, what are we going to do? We're going to skip over to, jump about 3 slides, please. That one there. This was another interesting technical one where this company actually started with sampling the gut juices, I guess, in order to do research on what the flora and fauna inside the gut was. And through working with them, we were able to come up with a technique of figuring out where the capsule was, so a navigation technology with a bunch of proprietary sensing technology. And And then we were able to figure out a miniature assay technology and a communication technology, so you didn't have to recover the pill. And so actually, through technical innovation and close collaboration with their marketing people, actually able to enunciate a brand new market value proposition they never even thought of before. So it's one of those interesting trade-offs. Why would you ask a question if you had no idea that something's possible? So it's kind of the evolutionary discovery almost. So that company was able to raise $100 million based on the potential of what you can do with that. There's so much more I'd love to tell you. Maybe just jump one more. Yeah, this is an interesting case in terms of value proposition design. A company, it's kind of a failure story, which is not a good one to end on perhaps, but it's an Australian company, developed a way to do objective perimetry. So, perimetry is where you look around, you measure how a retina is degrading, basically, to do with AMD, macular degeneration. So that you can normally you look at it in a machine, little lights turn off and on, and then you say whether you can see them or not. And this, but it's not very objective and it's not very repeatable. These guys figured out a way to do that in an objective, repeatable way, and was remarkable with electrodes on the head and everything. And when they got all the way to go into market and launched in the U.S. in a partnership with a big German company that we were working with at the time. And it totally failed. And when we sort of talked to people about what happened, they basically said, well, there's two problems with this. One of them is it actually takes more tech time than the other technology. And it's not required. There's not actually a therapeutic change that you do based on this diagnostic. It's interesting and useful for a doctor to know in some way, but there wasn't a matching therapeutic. So the payment to the doctor was ultimately worse because it cost more to administer, and they didn't need it. So it sounds kind of obvious in retrospect, and yet obviously they hired executives, raised capital, went through all the launch and all that, and yet when you look back, it's obvious what stories they missed. So with that, if we could move forward just to the Pathfinder framework, then I will wrap up. If you're interested in a set of gate criteria as to how do you know that you've done well enough on some of these things, then you can send me an email. My email's on the last slide, and we'll send you something. And with that, I'm open to questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. That was great. And I really enjoyed all of those examples, as I'm sure all of our attendees did as well. That was really interesting. Just a few questions here. So starting out, there's a question here. For a startup, as a rule of thumb, how long should the product definition stage be as a fraction of idea to launch time?
Sorry, that was my evil cackle. I think that it varies. It could be 3 months. It could be 4 years. It's not good enough until it's good enough. Until you can actually check the boxes that you actually have a value proposition that's killer. That's so much better that everybody will change their behaviors. And you're not there till you're there. And sometimes it looks promising, and you have all this momentum. You're talking as if you're done, but you're really not done, and you have to circle back. And so I think that the most important thing is not to fool yourself. Actually, get some very dispassionate, very experienced people as a board or as advisors or something to be skeptical and to keep challenging you, and they'll tell you when you got it right.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like that. And then, what avenues do you recommend for connecting to those potential customers, doctors, and users for those studies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, we found that they're often pretty open, but it's a bit of a you want a mix of sort of the KOLs, the more prestigious ones with podium power, and just ones that you can get access to easily. And I think you'll find in many companies that it kind of you step from one to the next to the next. You work your way up the hierarchy, as it were. But whatever environment, city that you're in, there will be an incubator. There will be some people who've had some success in medical technology commercialization. You can get associated with them. They'll have credibility to get in the door of hospitals and so on. I think really the key is to be bold and aim high, and try to get the best people in the world ultimately to be your allies. They're all excited about this too, right? A lot of the most prominent doctors are sort of frustrated engineer wannabes. That's what I find.
Yeah, absolutely. And then with the practical importance of regulatory requirements for human factors, how have you seen companies integrate that into the product definition as well?
Yeah, that's great. So I would say by and large, people underappreciate both the importance and the regulatory for human factors. So the IEC 62366 standard sort of is, it requires both formative study and also a summative study. And they cost more than you think to do them properly. Formative is a little more flexible. That's in the product definition sort of category. But you actually have to be dispassionate about it and go talk to a lot of people and ask them what their challenges are. And the more you can give them in terms of prototypes to play with and so on, just to see what they think. On the summative side, you really have to be pretty formal about it. You need to do it behind a mirrored glass. You want to yell at them like, "Oh my God, like just open the effing box and look at the instructions," so you almost need to take a couple of kicks at that. Like, you don't want to fail your formal summative, but what can you do during development to ensure that you don't fool yourself? Because you're deeply familiar with your thing and you care about it. That's your main thing in the world. For them, that's just another part of their day. They just got to do it, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've gone through quite a few of those human factor studies, and definitely get what you're saying with just follow the work instructions or whatever. So yeah, absolutely. And then we have another question here. What are your thoughts about the reimbursement strategy as part of product definition?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. Oh, gosh, I wish I had all day to talk to you guys, because this is really this is like the heart of everything. So really, reimbursement strategy is also more important than a lot of people think. There seems to be this notion that, well, this is going to be useful, it's going to be much better, it'll just become the standard of care. And actually, if you spend a little time on a show floor at a major medical conference, you start to realize these guys, they plan to buy something this year for their office or their hospital. They've got a budget of $100,000, and they've got about 50 things that they can look at. And they got some of them that will pay them back, and some of them won't. And some of them that address the biggest pains they have clinically, and some of them that are sort of nice to have. And but I guarantee that it will be your device will be adopted much faster if it's got a really clear reimbursement, or a big financial advantage, not just reimbursement. Like, we've seen things that flew off the shelves because they saved days in the ICU. That's a giant savings for the hospital, or that sort of thing. Where you really run into problem is where the financial benefits don't accrue to the buyer. Like, you make a thing that will allow a knee implant to work better, but it turns out that the people who pay for your technology are not the ones that will benefit by the knee implant lasting longer. That sort of thing. That's so I'm sort of talking a little more broadly about the financial model, but another big piece of reimbursement is that as a startup, if you're a startup, you do not have the luxury to get a new CPT code. Like, there's no way. That's going to take 5 years, a pile of clinical data, lobbying. So most sophisticated investors won't invest in things where that require a new CPT code to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, it looks like we're about out of time. So I am going to wrap up here. First of all, just wanted to thank you, Scott. Again, great presentation. Thank you for answering these questions. On the note of the questions too, any of the questions that we didn't get to, Scott will get a list of these questions and he'll be able to follow up with you guys on these questions. I want to thank everyone for attending the session today as well. And as a reminder, in about 10 minutes, there's another session coming up on medical device project pitfalls and how to avoid them. If you're interested and registered, just use that unique link and to tune in. And if you aren't signed up, then you can register for the next session at virtual-summit.greenlight.guru. Thank you again, Scott. Any closing statements?
Oh, this has been totally fun. I think this has been my most favorite virtual conference I've been to so far. So thanks so much.
Awesome. That's great to hear. Appreciate the kind words. And yeah, thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the True Quality Virtual Summit. And take care.
Okay, thanks so much.